For 80 years their story was buried, not beneath stone, not beneath silence, but beneath the fog of forgotten history. This is the untold fate of Charlie Company, and the ghosts they left behind. The year was 1944. Europe was a continent in ruins. Cities crumbled into ash. Villages smoldered. Millions displaced, millions more dead. And across the Atlantic, the United States had poured its youth into the fire, into North Africa, into Italy, into the beaches of Normandy. Among the countless units scattered across Europe stood the men of Charlie Company, 141st Infantry Regiment, part of the 36th Infantry Division, the Texas Division. But Charlie Company was not made of Texans alone. They were drawn from across the United States. Farmhands from Iowa, steelworkers from Pennsylvania, dockworkers from New Jersey, students from Ohio. Ordinary boys transformed into soldiers by necessity, by duty, and by the endless churn of a war that demanded everything. Some were barely 19. Others had left young families behind. They carried with them photographs tucked into breast pockets, letters folded and refolded until the ink faded. They carried rifles heavier than some of their frames. And they carried fear, though most buried it under humor, under grit, under the camaraderie that only war forges. By autumn of 1944, they had already endured months of combat. From the blood-soaked landings in southern France to the slow push through hilltop villages and vineyards, they had fought the German army step by brutal step. Every victory was paid for in blood. Every advance was shadowed by the question, who will not return? And then came the order. The Vosges Mountains, eastern France. October. A range of dense forests, steep ridges, and valleys where fog lingered like a shroud. The Germans knew the land well, had fortified it, and were determined to hold it. For the Americans, it was one of the most unforgiving terrains of the war. Charlie Company was tasked with advancing deeper into the woods, pushing farther than supply lines could reliably reach. To take and hold ground at any cost. Commanders called it routine, just another operation. But to the men on the ground, it was a sentence written in uncertainty. They packed light. Ammunition, rations, canteens. Some carried extra socks, knowing the misery of wet boots in freezing weather. Others carried small tokens, a St. Christopher medal, a lucky coin, a Bible passed down from a mother's trembling hand. They marched into the mist, rifles slung, bayonets fixed, boots sinking into mud that seemed to drag them backward with every step. The forest swallowed them whole. For days they pushed forward. Skirmishes erupted. German machine guns barked from hidden nests. Mortar shells rained down, sending dirt and shrapnel into the air. Trees splintered like matchsticks. The men hugged the earth, dug into frozen soil, and waited for the silence that always came after violence. And in those silences, they thought of home, of safety, of whether they would ever see either again. By October 24th, Charlie Company had reached a position deep within the Vosges, too deep. They were cut off from reinforcements. Their supply lines severed. Ammunition ran low. Food dwindled. Radios crackled with static, their pleas for resupply often drowned in the chaos of the front. But they held. They held because that was what soldiers did. They held because surrender was unthinkable. They held because beside them was not just a fellow soldier but a brother. What followed would echo for decades. The encirclement, the siege, the transformation of Charlie Company from a fighting unit into a band of survivors, clinging to hope as the fog thickened and the forest closed in. They did not know then that history would almost forget them, that their story would be buried beneath official reports, beneath headlines, beneath the march of time. But history does not forget. Not forever. And in the silence of the Vosges, in the cold October mist, the first chapter of their ordeal was being written in blood, in hunger, in defiance. This was the beginning of Charlie Company's long descent into the forgotten pages of World War II. The second night in the Vosges was colder than the first. The rain had stopped, but the fog was thicker than ever. It hung between the trees like smoke, swallowing the lantern glow, muffling the sound of boots on wet ground. For Charlie Company there was no warmth, no food, no certainty. Only the knowledge that somewhere in the darkness the Germans were waiting. By dawn they realized the truth. They were cut off. The radios sputtered with static, broken fragments of voices from headquarters. Reinforcements were delayed. The supply lines had collapsed. The company had marched too far, too fast, deeper into the mountains than anyone had planned. And now they were surrounded. Lieutenant Robert Hastings gathered his platoon leaders in the shelter of a shattered tree. His voice was calm, steady, even as his hands shook. "We hold here," he said. "Dig in. Make every bullet count. Help is coming." But in his eyes the men could see the doubt. The days blurred together. The forest became their prison. Food was the first to vanish. Rations had been light even before the encirclement. Now men tore open their last cans of beans, splitting them between 2 or 3. Others gnawed on crusts of bread gone hard with damp. By the 4th day, some chewed pine needles to trick their stomachs into silence. Water was worse. Streams trickled through the forest, but every trip to fetch it meant risking sniper fire. Private Jimmy Carver volunteered more than once, dashing between trees with his canteen, mud splashing up his legs. Each time he returned, breathless, holding just enough water for a few swallows. The wounded lay in shallow foxholes, shivering under thin blankets. The medics did what they could with dwindling bandages, tearing strips from their own shirts to bind wounds. Morphine ran out. Men bit down on sticks as bullets were dug from their flesh. Fever spread. Some prayed for sleep. Some prayed not to wake at all. And then there was the constant fear. The forest was alive with whispers, the creak of branches, the rustle of leaves, the faint scrape of boots in the dark. Sniper fire cracked without warning, dropping men mid-sentence. Mortar shells rained down at night, lighting the sky with brief flashes of fire before plunging everything back into blackness. The men huddled in silence, listening to the earth shake, waiting for the next blast. Every shadow was an enemy. Every gust of wind sounded like death. And yet, amid the fear there was courage. Sergeant Henry Miller, the steelworker from Pittsburgh, walked the line each night. He spoke quietly to the men, offering a word here, a hand on the shoulder there. He carried no food to give them, no medicine to heal them, but he gave them something just as vital: hope. "Hold fast," he whispered. "We're not forgotten. They'll come for us." On the 3rd day of encirclement, a low drone echoed across the sky. The men looked up, shielding their eyes. It was a plane. An American C-47. Their hearts leapt. The men waved helmets, shouted, fired signal flares. And then, the parachutes opened. Supplies tumbled down through the mist, drifting like salvation from heaven. But the forest betrayed them. Many of the drops landed outside their perimeter into German hands. The men watched helplessly as enemy soldiers collected the food and ammunition meant for them. What they received was meager: a few crates of bandages, some chocolate bars, a handful of ammunition belts. It was not enough. Not nearly enough. Still, it was something. Enough to keep them fighting another day. Enough to hold on to the fragile thread of belief that rescue was still coming. At night, the forest echoed with prayers. Some men prayed aloud, voices trembling in the dark. Others whispered silently, lips moving over words remembered from church pews long ago. Private Jimmy Carver clutched the photograph of his sweetheart. Sergeant Miller wrote another page in his notebook, even as the ink ran thin. Lieutenant Hastings sat apart, staring into the fog, the weight of command crushing his shoulders. They were hungry. They were cold. They were dying. But they were still holding the line. And in that silence, broken only by the crack of distant rifles and the soft murmur of prayer, Charlie Company waited. For rescue. For relief. For an end that might never come. The dawn of the 5th day in the Vosges was not a dawn at all. The fog was so thick, so heavy, that the rising sun could not pierce it. The forest lay in shadow, dripping with rain, the air cold enough to cut through every coat and blanket. The men of Charlie Company were shadows themselves, hollow-eyed, gaunt, their uniforms stiff with mud and blood. Their weapons were few, their ammunition fewer still. And yet, when the first distant thud of German mortars broke the silence, they braced themselves once more. Because they knew what was coming. It began with fire. Mortars screamed overhead, shattering trees into jagged spears. Earth erupted in fountains of mud. Shrapnel hissed through the fog, striking men crouched low in their foxholes. Private Jimmy Carver pressed himself flat into the dirt, clutching the photograph of his sweetheart with one hand, his rifle with the other. His ears rang, his chest heaved, but when the barrage lifted and the sound of boots rushed forward through the mist, he rose. German infantry emerged like ghosts, rifles raised, bayonets fixed. Their shouts echoed in the trees, harsh and guttural. Charlie Company opened fire. Rifles cracked. A single machine gun rattled from a nest carved into a fallen tree. Grenades burst in sprays of smoke and earth. For every German who fell, 2 more pushed forward. But the men of Charlie Company held. They fought with the desperation of men who knew there was no retreat, no second chance. By mid-morning, the first wave was broken. The Germans fell back, dragging their wounded, leaving the forest floor littered with the dead. Charlie Company remained, shaken, bleeding, but alive. There was no rest. The second wave struck by noon, heavier than the first. Machine guns raked the American lines, cutting down anyone who dared to move. Mortars thumped in steady rhythm, tearing the forest apart tree by tree. Sergeant Henry Miller, the steelworker from Pittsburgh, crawled from hole to hole, shouting above the chaos. "Hold fast. Keep firing. Don't you dare give an inch." He carried ammunition belts scavenged from fallen comrades, pressing them into shaking hands. He fired his own rifle until the barrels smoked, then picked up another. His voice carried above the storm, not with fear but with defiance. And then he was struck. A burst of gunfire caught him across the chest. He staggered, fell to his knees, his notebook slipping from his pocket into the mud. The men saw him fall, but they did not stop fighting. They could not. The second wave lasted 2 hours. When it ended, the forest was littered with more bodies, the ground churned into a graveyard of mud, bark, and blood. Sergeant Miller lay still, his face turned toward the gray sky. By the afternoon, Charlie Company was no longer a company. Half their number were gone. The wounded groaned in shallow pits, their cries growing fainter with each passing hour. The living crouched in silence, listening to the distant sounds of German preparation. The third wave came at dusk. It was the heaviest yet. Mortars fell like rain. Machine guns swept the ground. German infantry surged in from all sides, closing in like a tightening noose. Lieutenant Robert Hastings stood tall amid the chaos, his face streaked with mud and exhaustion. He shouted orders, rallying what remained of his men. "Hold the line. For God's sake, hold it." Private Carver fought beside him, his rifle nearly empty. When the last bullet was fired, he picked up a fallen comrade's weapon and kept going. When that ran dry, he fixed his bayonet and charged. It was chaos. Men fought hand to hand in the mud. Rifles swung like clubs. Knives flashed. Fists slammed into helmets. The screams of the wounded mixed with the shouts of the living and the thunder of guns. One squad, reduced to only 3 men, held off a machine gun nest with grenades scavenged from enemy belts. Another pair carried a wounded comrade back through a hail of fire, refusing to leave him behind. Everywhere, the forest echoed with desperation. By nightfall, the third wave broke. But Charlie Company was broken too. That night, the survivors huddled in silence. The forest glowed faintly with fires from shattered trees. The air stank of smoke and death. There was no food left. No water. No ammunition worth speaking of. Some men whispered prayers. Others stared blankly into the fog, their minds already far away. A few clutched keepsakes, photographs, dog tags, letters never finished. Lieutenant Hastings wrote a final note in the dirt with a stick, his pencil long lost. "To my men I am proud. To my family I love you." Private Carver folded his sweetheart's photograph one last time and tucked it into his breast pocket. The forest was quiet, except for the faint moans of the dying. And the silence was heavier than any sound. At dawn on the 7th day, the Germans struck for the last time. This time there were no mortars first, no machine guns to soften the line. Just the slow, steady advance of infantry through the fog. They knew Charlie Company had nothing left. The Americans rose anyway. They lifted empty rifles, fixed bayonets, clenched fists. And they fought. They fought with weapons scavenged from the ground. They fought with knives, with shovels, with bare hands. They fought in silence, not with hope of victory, but with the refusal to surrender. One by one they fell. Hastings, shouting until a burst cut him down. Carver, charging with a bayonet, cut down before he reached the line. Others vanished into the fog, their fates unknown. And then, finally, it was over. The forest was still. The Germans moved among the fallen, searching for survivors. A handful were taken prisoner, gaunt, hollow-eyed, broken. The rest lay silent, scattered among the trees. Charlie Company was gone. In headquarters, miles away, their sacrifice was recorded in a single line. Company presumed destroyed in action. No medals. No speeches. No headlines. The war moved on. Other battles were fought. Other men died. But in the forest of the Vosges, beneath the dripping trees, the silence of Charlie Company remained. When the guns fell silent in the Vosges, Charlie Company was gone. What remained were the echoes. The smoldering craters. The broken trees. The lifeless bodies scattered in the mud. And the silence. The war machine moved on. New orders came, new offensives planned. Headquarters noted the company as lost, a line in a report that would be read, filed, and forgotten. There were no parades for the fallen, no newsreels to honor their stand. Back home, in towns and cities across America, telegrams began to arrive. Western Union boys pedaled their bicycles up quiet streets, carrying envelopes in trembling hands. Doors opened. Mothers stood in kitchens, wiping flour from their hands. Fathers stepped out from barns, sweat still on their brows. Sweethearts hurried down porches with hearts that leapt at the sight of mail, only to break when they saw the expression on the boy's face. Each message was short. Regret to inform you. Killed in action. Presumed missing. For some families, the body never came home. Their sons were buried where they fell, beneath the forest floor, marked only by a wooden cross and a dog tag. For others, the graves came later, in neat white rows across Europe, maintained by strangers in far-off lands. But for all, there was the silence. Letters stopped arriving. Christmases passed with empty chairs at the table. Children grew up with only photographs and folded flags. Wives grew old telling the same stories, clinging to the same memories, their voices trembling with time. And slowly, as the years became decades, Charlie Company faded from memory. The war had many heroes. The headlines celebrated the landings at Normandy, the victory in Paris, the liberation of camps. The sacrifice of one lost company in a fog-choked forest was a detail, swallowed by history. But not for the families. In Pittsburgh, Sergeant Henry Miller's widow kept his notebook, the pages stained with mud and blood. She read it aloud at the kitchen table to her grandchildren, her voice cracking with each entry. In Ohio, Private Jimmy Carver's sweetheart never married. She kept his photograph in a frame by her bedside until her final day, whispering his name before she closed her eyes. In Kansas, Lieutenant Hastings' younger brother joined the Army years later, carrying his sibling's name on his lips, determined not to let it vanish. And yet, for most of America, Charlie Company was gone. Decades passed. The Vosges grew silent again. Trees regrew. Grass covered the scars of craters. Tourists hiked the trails with no knowledge of the bones beneath their feet. The forest became beautiful once more. But beneath its roots, the silence remained. Then, nearly 80 years later, the silence broke. It began with a local historian in France, combing through forgotten archives. Old maps. Unit logs. A scribbled note from a medic who mentioned a company surrounded. The historian traced the records to the forest, to a stretch of ground no one had walked in decades. A search began. Metal detectors swept the earth. Shovels struck soil. And then the first relic emerged, a rusted helmet, its liner still intact. More followed. Dog tags, dented canteens, the twisted remains of rifles. And in the mud, half buried and nearly unreadable, the notebook of Sergeant Henry Miller. Its pages were stained, but the words were there: hold fast. We're not forgotten. The discovery spread quickly. News outlets carried the story. Families, now 3 generations removed, saw names they had grown up hearing only in whispers. For some, it was the first confirmation of what had happened, the first time they knew where their grandfathers or great-uncles had fought and died. A memorial was planned. Survivors' descendants traveled to France. They stood among the trees, listening to the silence, imagining the echoes of battle, the voices of young men cut short. Some wept openly. Others stood in silence, fists clenched, eyes closed. And in that moment, Charlie Company was remembered. Not as a line in a forgotten report. Not as men swallowed by fog. But as fathers, brothers, sons. As Americans who had held fast in the face of impossible odds. Their story became more than history. It became a mirror. Because Charlie Company's fate was not unique. Across wars, across generations, countless men had been lost, their sacrifices buried beneath silence. From the trenches of World War I to the jungles of Vietnam, from desert sands to mountain passes, America has always carried its share of untold stories. And each one matters. Charlie Company's rediscovery reminds us of a truth: silence does not erase sacrifice. Time does not erase memory. What is forgotten can be found again. What is buried can be brought back to life. But only if we keep searching. Only if we keep telling the stories. So as the families gathered in France, as the names of the lost were spoken aloud once more, the silence broke. The voices returned, carried not in shouts of battle, but in whispers of remembrance. The forest stood still. The wind moved softly through the trees. And for the first time in nearly 8 decades, Charlie Company was no longer alone. They were heard. They were remembered. And they will never again be silent. If this story moved you, if it made you pause, if it made you think about the cost of silence and the weight of sacrifice, I ask you to take one step further. Share this story. Comment your thoughts. Subscribe to keep these voices alive. Because forgotten does not mean gone. Silence does not mean peace. And as long as we keep remembering, they will never truly be lost again.